as I approached this bar, getting ready to go through the intersection, what I didn't know is that there was an altercation that was taking place between two guys. One guy was hitting on another guy's girlfriend. They were drinking. This altercation led to the front door of this bar. And as I was driving past this bar, one of the guys in this altercation stumbled into the street at the exact time I was passing by. So I hit this man from the front of my car. I ran over him. I could feel every crunch. I could hear every crack from the front of my car to the back of my car. And I came to a resting spot. I mean, this is happening in seconds.
Lance, your husband, you're a keynote speaker, coach, so much more, and you help people and organizations keep it simple, stay consistent, achieve results, man. I'm excited for this show. Thank you for your time, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
I like to start my shows off by going back to the beginning. Like, where did you grow up and what was childhood like for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of my story. I talk about the fact that from the moment that I took my first breath in that hospital room, the odds were stacked against me. That usually surprises a lot of folks when they see a 6'2" white guy with brown spiky hair standing in front of a room. In fact, I did that last week with a group of 800 high school students. 797 of them did not look like me. Three of them looked like me. And so I got a couple of chuckles because I
Wow.
say, hey, listen, from the moment I took my first breath, the odds were stacked against me. I was born to my dad, who initially, due to some circumstances, he was a high school dropout. Now, he did go on to get his GED, but if you think about the fact that now I've got two high school graduate parents living paycheck to paycheck, I wasn't going to grow up in this country club family, access to great schools, and what comes with that. I went on to lose my mom to suicide 4 days before my first birthday. So now, shy of 1 year old, I'm going to have to face the world without my mom. So
Wow.
here we are in Cleveland, Ohio, and ultimately, my dad remarries. I have a step family. I have three step siblings. I ultimately then get two half brothers. But growing up in that step family, I was the outcast. I was the outlier. I was the kid from another mother. And with that came some misunderstanding, some mistreatment, and a lot of what I talk about adversity.
Mm. Wow, man, what a crazy start to your life there, man. Man, and you were young, you said, when your mom committed suicide there, but as you got into high school age and started going through the other adversities you were going through, like, how do you cope with that? How do you move forward with that and deal with that mentally?
Yeah, it was tough, as you might imagine. What made it tougher, Eric, was as I was growing up as a young boy, many members of my mom's side of the family, they couldn't accept that my mom committed suicide. So think about my mom's mom, my grandmother, my mom's sister, my aunt. My dad was once a family member, but now they were trying to suggest that my dad was not just my remaining father, the one that was responsible for raising me and taking care of me, but they would go on to suggest that my dad murdered my mom. So
Whoa.
here I am growing up in my step family now with my stepmom and step siblings. But whenever I would have visitation with my grandmother and my aunt and other members of my mom's side of the family, they were talking in my ear, trying to convince me that my dad murdered my mom, despite there not being any evidence of that. And so I wrestled with a lot of questions around, well, why was I born into this
Mm.
situation? And why am I growing up in this step family? And why do I have my mom's side of the family trying to convince me that my dad murdered my mom when my dad seems to be a good guy and he seems to be a loving dad? In the midst of this, we started going to church, Eric,
Wow.
and we all became a born again Christian family. And we would go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday. So here we're now a Christian family, and I'm still wrestling with a lot of these questions. Hey,
Sure.
God, why are you allowing all of this to happen
Mhm.
as I'm growing up as a elementary, middle school student and into my high school years?
Wow. Man, I think we all have this pivotal moment in our journey with Jesus where we fully take the step ourselves. right? Like we might grow up in church, like you said, you're going on Sunday and Wednesday and multiple times throughout a week there. What was that moment for you when you fully felt like this is my decision to step in and accept Jesus into my heart?
Yeah, well, I always knew, right? John 3:16, it's a
Yeah.
one-time event, right? Do you lose your Christianity? That's a question that lots of people I find wrestle with. And
Yeah.
so always coming back to that verse that despite the trials, the tribulations, the adversity, despite our sin, what we do, what we think, what we say, doesn't necessarily mean that we lose our Christianity. And so
Right.
I knew that growing up as a child and as a teenager and even into my adulthood, but I wrestled with it for a long time. In high school, my dad ultimately had divorced my stepmom,
Mm.
due to some difficulties that kept repeating themselves in that relationship. And so here I am at 17 years old as a junior in high school, living with my dad. And he said, "Hey, I want to go live with this girlfriend that he was dating at the time." And after some difficult conversation between my dad and I decided that I was going to live alone. So here I am at 17 years old as a junior in high school, living alone in my own apartment into my entire senior year of high school, living alone in my own apartment. And as I navigated that situation, ultimately to become a first generation college student, working 5 days a week, putting myself through school, really focusing on my controllables, my grades, working, getting myself through this sort of military state of mind to focus on the outcome. I was still wrestling Eric with a lot of questions like, hey, God, where are you in all of this? And
Mm.
what about the world's major religions? And why does God allow bad things to happen? And I'm living in the world, right? I'm drinking and I'm smoking some cigarettes and I'm doing things maybe I shouldn't be doing with girlfriends that I was dating at the time. Am
Sure.
I still a Christian? Am I
Mm.
still a Christian? Everyone certainly seems to be hypocritical in many ways. Hey, I go to church on Sunday morning, but yet I'm going to act differently throughout the week and on Friday and Saturday night.
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit later in our chat this morning about how I ultimately came back to how I started
Mm.
in
Yeah.
my Christian journey.
Wow. Now, as I was reading through your website, there was a tragic accident that occurred while you were driving one time. Can you walk me through what happened here, man?
Yeah, so I mean, I get out of college, I go on to have lots of success in sales and leadership, primarily in the banking and financial services, wealth management space. So in my 20s and 30s, things are pretty good, right? For the most part, I made it. Vice president, senior vice president, wear the custom suit, make the good income, have the net worth, have the house. In many cases, I had beat the odds, Eric.
Mm.
Well, here I am on a Saturday night in my early 30s, single. I'd had one beer at home, and a couple of buddies said, "Hey, Lance, why don't you come meet us at this local bar?" So I said, "Okay, that's cool. I'll come meet you." I knew I was okay to drive because I had one beer, and I figured, okay, it had worked its way out of my system. But as I'm driving to this bar to meet my buddies, I had to first go through this intersection. And at this intersection, the stoplight, there was another bar that sat on the corner called Ed's Tavern. And it was packed, Eric. It was packed inside. I could see there were lots of people outside of the bar. There was a Duke Carolina basketball game being played. And as I approached this bar, getting ready to go through the intersection, what I didn't know is that there was an altercation that was taking place between two guys. One guy was hitting on another guy's girlfriend. They were drinking. This altercation led to the front door of this bar. And as I was driving past this bar, one of the guys in this altercation stumbled into the street at the exact time I was passing by. So I hit this man from the front of my car. I ran over him. I could feel every crunch. I could hear every crack from the front of my car to the back of my car. And I came to a resting spot. I mean, this is happening in seconds.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, what just happened? I feel like I just hit something. It felt like I ran over a log.
Sure.
And I noticed in the mirror that there's a guy laying in the street and people are starting to hover around him.
Mm.
Come to find out, I had taken this man's life.
Wow.
And the minutes after, the days ahead and the weeks ahead were going to be tough. But it was also a pivotal time in my life when I needed God to show up some way, somehow.
Yeah, man. After experiencing that, man, what a crazy story. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Um, I can't imagine being in that position. What's your, you know, your faith like in the aftermath? You know, what was that process for you to get back to finding peace and ultimately moving forward through this?
Yeah, look, as I said, I gave you some pieces of my story, the journey, right? Because
Yeah.
here I am now in my early 30s. I'm thinking to myself, gosh, man, life sure is tough, right? I was born to this difficult family situation. I lost my mom to suicide. People are trying to convince me that my dad murdered my mom. I grew up in this difficult step family, lots of mistreatment and misunderstanding. We moved in and out of the house constantly. I ultimately tried to commit suicide myself at 13 years old. Ultimately, that was a catalyst for my dad to divorced my stepmom. Then I find myself living alone at 17 years old, putting myself through my senior year of high school, the 4 years of college. I finally had made it, had all this career success. I'm at the top of the mountain here at 30, something years old. And then boom, now I'm partly responsible for taking a man's life. Meanwhile, I'm still wrestling with all these questions of God, where are you in all this? And
Yeah.
why are these things happening? And it was the exact time I needed God to show up. And what I didn't know, Eric, is that there was another man. His name is Land Height. And he's a guy that I had worked with at a previous firm several years ago prior to that event. He's 20 years older than me. We weren't friends. I didn't have his cell phone number. We didn't have email addresses. We weren't keeping in touch. We had a couple of meetings when we were loose coworkers once upon a time, but
Yeah.
he had read about my accident in the paper. And he said, man, I know this guy, Lance. And he said his heart broke for me. And he said he felt a prompt by the Holy Spirit to write me a handwritten note.
Mm.
So he writes me a handwritten note. Somehow he found my address, and I get this handwritten note in the mail. Nobody else had written me a handwritten note. And it just basically said, hey, Lance, I heard about your accident. I read about your accident. My heart broke for you. If you ever want to get together for a cup of coffee or just a phone call, here's my card. God loves you.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, why does this guy Land care so much about me? Why is he writing me this handwritten note? One phone call led to many calls, led to many cups of coffees and breakfasts and lunches and dinners. And Land has become a major mentor in my life for well over a decade. And he started
Wow.
helping me address some of these questions I was having about my faith and what's my purpose and what am I doing here and how do I wrestle with being this single guy and how am I ever going to get married one day and so on and so forth. And so God worked through Land
Hmm.
to follow a prompt by the Holy Spirit to write me a handwritten note, which has just led to this beautiful relationship. And there's more to the story I can talk about here in a moment.
Yeah, man. What an awesome, powerful mentor to have in your life. And what a cool thing that he listened to this prompting from the Holy Spirit to write that handwritten letter. I'm a big fan of writing handwritten letters, man. I think that's the only way to really communicate truly, authentically nowadays, man. Um, One of the things I saw as I was looking through kind of your videos and things, I came across a clip that I thought was really cool. You were talking about these four pillars of success. And man, can you deep dive into those four pillars that you talked about? I think you were talking maybe to a younger crowd, but like, why are those four so important?
Yeah, part of what I do is really lean on that statement that we are all expertly positioned to help our past self.
Yeah,
Maybe you've heard a different version of that, right? You're uniquely gifted. You have a gift inside of you. Everything that you've gone through personally and professionally, that you've overcome, that you've gotten through, you are now expertly positioned today to go and help the person that's out there today that you once upon a time were.
yeah,
And so part of my speaking is going in and pouring into the youth, right? Going back in and pouring into the high school student or the college student that I once was. In fact, just last week, I spoke to 800 high school students, freshmen and sophomores,
wow,
that are in low socioeconomic situations. Many of them have brokenness in their family, and they're looking around and they don't have a lot of good examples of people that are breaking the cycle of what they were born into, right? The odds being stacked against them.
mhm,
And so I talked to them about four decisions that I had to make, during those difficult times that they find themselves in. Number one, I had to decide that I was going to be the change. right? It's a mindset shift of regardless of what you were born into or your circumstances today, if you're living and breathing, you can make up your mind on how you might respond to those situations differently.
Mhm.
Redirect that energy for the positive, right? Control your controllables.
Yeah.
Number two, it's one thing to think about things. We think about things when we're laying in bed at 2 in the morning and we're driving down the road, or maybe we're taking a shower. It's a whole nother thing to take action. So number two, you have to rise up. You have to take action, not wait for the perfect plan, but take messy action. Make decisions to do things that others are not willing to do to achieve some level of success. Number three, hustle, right? You're taking action, but you also may need to look at the person in front of you, behind you, to the left of you, to the right of you, and say, hey, what can I do one extra repetition that Erik's not doing
Mhm.
to create separation, to create a differentiation between me and you? I don't care if that's academics. I don't care if it's athletics, right? One more rep in the gym, one extra hour of studying in order to create the separation so you set yourself up for success. And then lastly, number four, it's that gain time mindset. If you make up your mind to be the change, number two, you decide to rise up and take action. Number three, you're putting in the repetitions, you're hustling. Well, then you can't help but get into this mindset of anyone, anywhere, anytime. You want to play
Yeah.
in your field or my field? You want to play in your court or my court, right? You're ready for the opponent. And so those four things set me up back then, but they have carried me through over 2 decades of sales and leadership, even today in what I do for a living.
Come on. Using your adversity to advantage, to your advantage, man. What a cool thing. I was 39 years old before I shared my story publicly. For you, how did you get over that fear of sharing your story publicly and being transparent, being authentic? And how did that change your outlook on life, man?
Erik, look, man, you and I were meant to talk this morning. I really genuinely believe that. You're asking so many great questions at exactly the right moment. So I've talked about the fact that I have this guy named Land who's been a mentor to me, been pouring into me day after day, week after week for years. Okay, at this point, it's like 13, 14 years. Well, I get to a place where I've matured, right? I'm come back to my Christian faith. I meet a girl. She becomes my fiance. I get married. I have 2 daughters. Okay. And Lance says, hey, Lance, will you pour into my son, Chad? So Chad is 10 years younger than me. And he says, hey, look, my son Chad is struggling with drugs and alcohol and just mental health stuff. I'd love for you to pour into my son Chad. So Chad and I start getting together, coffee and lunch. Chad starts sharing with me his struggles. I start being able to pour into him, right? Act as a mentor to him. Chad gets on the other side of recovery. He starts getting on the other side of recovery. So he's clean and sober.
Mm.
Okay. Chad starts taking his past adversity, his trials, his tribulations, and turning them into his advantage.
Wow.
Because now he starts going back to school at night to get his addiction recovery and mental health education to go and help his past self, right? The people that are struggling. Number
Yeah.
two, he starts working at this men's recovery shelter, and he starts working the night shift. Number three, he starts a podcast. He starts sharing his story. Then he starts bringing on other people to share similar stories of using adversity to now be a place that they go and drive purpose, impact, and success. So I start seeing what Chad's doing. He starts going to speak to church groups. He starts going to speak to high schools. And he goes, hey, Lance, I know you got a story. Why don't you come up on my podcast and share your story? No, 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 Chad, I'm good, buddy. Thanks, man. I'm not getting on a podcast and sharing my story where hypothetically the whole world can hear. Hey, Lance, you're a pretty good speaker. You speak at work. Like, why don't you start sharing your story like at a men's group at church or maybe a high school, right, for the benefit of others? No, 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 I'm good, dude. I'm good, dude. But see, Chad was persistent. He kept asking me. So finally, I become a guest on Chad's podcast. I share my story. And then I decide, okay, cool. I'm going to go share my story at a men's group at church. This started 2 years ago, by the way, Erik.
Wow.
So then I go share my story at a men's group at church. 60 guys, 75 guys. Chad was front row, Land was front row. Then I had other opportunities to start sharing in schools in and around my hometown to help my past self.
Mm.
Earlier this year in February, I go to this Christian men's group, this business men's group in town in Charlotte, where people get up and share their story every single Thursday morning. I noticed on the agenda that Chad was sharing his story in the coming weeks. And there was an open speaking slot the week before him.
Hmm.
I said, oh, well, I didn't even know Chad went to this group, and he's sharing a story in a couple of weeks and there's an open slot. So I guess I'll volunteer to speak in the open slot. So I shared my story. Chad was there, Land was there this February. The very next week, I introduced Chad. Chad shared his story. I was there. His dad, Land, was there. I launched my professional speaking business in May of this year. That's
Wow.
my full-time work. I don't have a corporate job anymore. I'm not a senior vice president, divisional sales director at any corporation.
Wow.
Chad working the night shift 3 months ago at Charlotte Rescue Mission. All the men went to sleep, 400 men. And then he went to sleep in his room on Sunday night at 33 years old. He died in his sleep. He didn't wake up the next morning.
Wow.
So if you think about what I'm saying here, I'm going to
Yeah.
recap this real quickly.
Yeah.
I suffered a tragic event. Land followed a prompt by the Holy Spirit to reach out to me via a handwritten note. Land starts pouring into me. I get to a place where I'm mature enough where I can now start pouring back into his son, Chad. Chad gets to a place where he starts using his past to go out and impact thousands of people's lives, which he then encourages me to start sharing my story, which I then start doing, which I then have now launched a professional speaking and coaching business because Chad initially encouraged me to do it. And now Chad's with Jesus. At
Wow.
33 years old, Chad died at 33. Jesus died at 33. Chad spent the past 3 years in ministry, clean and sober, just like Jesus spent 3 years in ministry. So I could talk to you for hours about this kind of stuff, but
Wow.
about as quick as I could kind of give you and the listeners an idea that despite our circumstances, God can still be working through it, through
Man.
other people to still bring glory.
Yeah. So powerful, man. And I had no idea that's where the story was going to go, man. That is crazy that Chad died in his sleep, man. What an amazing legacy though that he was able to leave and recover and start impacting lives before he left this earth, man. Man. You said that you went full time as a speaker earlier this year. As entrepreneurs, we eat like kings sometimes, and sometimes we eat like top ramen. Like for you, what's going through your mind as you decide, I'm going to step into this full time? And how did you combat those mindset battles that I'm sure hit you as you step into this? Having maybe imposter syndrome, or like what gave you the confidence to step into that?
Yeah, listen, man, they hit me every other hour. I was a senior vice president, divisional sales director, 22 years in corporate America.
Wow.
Custom suit, direct reports, lots of influence, salary, quarterly bonuses, 401k match, stock options, paid vacation days, benefits, pension. I got a wife and kids. My wife doesn't work. The logical, rational thing for me to do would be get a senior vice president job at a corporation.
Yeah.
I should do that right now. Go apply and get a full-time corporate job. Now, if you gave me an offer I couldn't refuse, maybe I would accept it. But I just gave you just pieces of the story, right? Pieces of the message.
Yeah.
And I feel this overwhelming calling to go out and share messaging, stories, to have even greater purpose, greater impact, which would also lead to lots of success in life and in my business.
Mhm.
I'm writing a book. I've got a book that's going to come out in a couple of months.
Come on.
I'm speaking on stages that I could have never imagined I would be speaking on. I'm getting paid to speak. I have people that want to hire me as their performance coach. I just had a meeting today at 9 o'clock with somebody
Wow.
that's ready to bring me on as his coach to help him navigate aspects of his life and his business.
Come on.
And so yes, imposter syndrome, who am I? Or the logical, rational thing for me to do is go be a senior vice president, go be corporate Lance. But I find peace in just resting in God has me where he has me. I'm getting signal that I'm on the right track, one foot in front of the other, trust the process.
Come on. Oh man, so good. Lance, I'm so excited to share this with folks because I think you talked about and touched on so many awesome points that will impact so many people that are in different areas of their life that are going through that adversity, that are struggling with that entrepreneur imposter syndrome. I struggle with that a lot still. I still work a full-time job, right? But man, thank you, Lance, for taking time out of your day and joining me on the show. I just, from a Christian faith follower myself, to just another one to say, man, you are doing amazing work and God is working through you to impact people, man. And I appreciate you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to have the opportunity to share. Like you just said, I just want your listeners to pause long enough to recognize that despite their circumstances, God can still be working. You may not
Yeah.
see it in the moment, you may see it in hindsight, but press into how you might be able to redirect the pain, the suffering, the trials, the tribulations to actually be the place that you discover purpose and go out and be able to impact so many people's lives in so many ways that you can't even fully imagine
Yeah.
the moment you're in right now.
Hey, if you've ever thought about starting a podcast but unsure where to go, you need to go check out erikallenmedia.com. Click on the resources tab there. I will walk you through how to start, launch, and run a podcast. I've recorded over 500 interviews since 2017, and I want to help you launch your podcast. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you catch every show when I drop them. Thanks again. Keep changing the world.